What I'm going to do is I'm going to reflect on science and evolution. I'm going to give you a little abridged history of the coronavirus. And on the way, I will tell you a little bit of chemistry and a little bit of biology, which I think everybody ought to know. This slide is just decorated with two of the foundational pillars of chemistry on the left and biology on the right. That is Mendeleev and his periodic table on the left, and Darwin and his ideas of natural selection and evolution on the right. Now, when you talk about science to an audience which does not contain many scientists in the midst of the audience, you're really talking to a general audience. And very often, scientists and the public don't really communicate particularly well. And this cartoon, which I found on the internet, sort of summarizes this. A husband and wife sitting down and saying, "This is the nicest conversation we've had in weeks. Let's not spoil it by talking. What I'm going to do today is actually talk." Now, we have to ask some questions. What is science? How is science? And is science useful? Because in asking these questions, you can ask the same question about any other discipline. And if you're going to do research, these are the kind of questions that one has to ask about the discipline. I've simply decorated this slide with cartoons which I pulled off the internet. But if you look at the top left cartoon, what is called physics trash talk, it says, "And your mama thinks Newton's second law replaced Newton's first law." So in effect, ideas of science are sometimes quite muddled in the eyes of the public. But scientists themselves are also strange. Here, for example, is a scientist telling another scientist on the top right, "I already wrote the paper, that's why it's so hard to get the right data." So many times it does not matter in which field you're working, data is important, and it's through data that one really does an analysis. What do scientists study? Science is really the study of nature. And the two most popular journals in science, one is called Science and the other is called Nature. Nature is in fact the older journal. In its very, very first issue, in the year 1869, it published an editorial. The editorial was written by the famous biologist Thomas Huxley. But what Huxley did was he didn't write the editorial. He merely translated from German into English an essay written by the German poet von Goethe. And what Goethe said was this: he defined nature. Nature, we are surrounded and embraced by her, powerless to penetrate ourselves from her and powerless to penetrate beyond her. Nature is something that's fascinated everybody. It fascinates the poets, for example. Wordsworth said that to the solid ground of nature, trust the mind which builds for eye. So you will find that literature very often is also, in some ways, interpretations of nature. But I draw your attention to a book. This is a book by Jacob Bronowski called The Ascent of Man. This is a book which is based on a very famous BBC television series which appeared in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the BBC commissioned Bronowski, a theoretical physicist and mathematician, to do this series. Bronowski traced the ascent of man from the very beginning, when man was still not civilized, when man was still a hunter-gatherer, all the way to the present era of science and technology. And Bronowski describes how he got his title. And this is what he says: "Among the multitude of animals which scamper, fly, burrow, and swim around us, man is the only one who is not locked into his environment. His imagination, his reason, his emotional subtlety and toughness made it possible for him not to accept the environment, but to change it. And that series of inventions by which man from age to age has remade his environment is a different kind of evolution, not biological, but cultural evolution. I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man." Note here that he uses the word culture. In India, the word culture has got a different connotation. This is culture in terms of all of humanity, not sections of humanity. How did human beings, biological organisms, how did they differentiate themselves from the animals? Every cultural peak is an invention in science and technology. Right from the beginning, from the invention of fire, the invention of tools, the invention of agriculture, all the way to the Industrial Revolution, the invention of electricity, and so forth. This I picked up from the Scientific American exactly 2 years ago, called the science tool. I've illustrated it. This was an essay. And what the author asked was, on what legs does science, and I would say any discipline, what does it rest on? It rests on three legs. It rests on data, it rests on theory, which explains the data, and it rests on communication of the explanation or the theory to everybody else. The slide has on its four corners old scientists, Copernicus, who taught us our place in the solar system, Harvey, who told us that blood is circulating in the body, Jenner, who gave us the first vaccine, and Darwin, of course, who gave us the ideas of evolution. This has all happened a long time ago. But when one observes nature, it's very important to have tools to observe nature. All of us can observe nature, but we have only one tool, our own eyes and our own senses. We can smell, we can hear, we can see. How can we see something which is too small so that our eyes can't see it? Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope. On the left of the slide is what Leeuwenhoek's microscope looked like in the 1600s. On the right is what you would see today in any biology laboratory, a nice microscope. Under this microscope, if you look at some tap water, you will see hundreds and millions of organisms floating around. You can't still see viruses with this microscope. You need the electron microscope to see. It's a question of scale. What can you see? Galileo invented the telescope and pointed it to the skies. What did he see? He saw the stars, he saw the planets, and he knew then that there was a much wider world outside. So cosmology on the one hand, microbiology on the other, were both born from these inventions. There are ways of doing science, and it's important to understand them, because sometimes the ways of doing science are not different from the ways of doing research in any other discipline. Darwin observed and classified. Mendeleev also observed and classified. Darwin observed nature. Mendeleev observed the elements as they were found by chemists and arranged them. Observation and classification is one way of doing science. The other way of doing science is experiment and observation. You do something, and then on the basis of what you observe, you try to explain your observation. Now, what is an observation? The classical observation, which everybody will talk about from school onwards, is Newton's ideas of gravity emerging from the fact that he observed an apple fall to the ground. Why do objects fall to the ground? Pasteur, of course, who I would say epitomizes much of science. He did a lot of basic research. He did a lot of applied research. Much of what he did is practically very useful. Including the procedures for pasteurization of milk, which we use routinely. Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. The more experiments you do, the more observations you're likely to make, and therefore discover something. There were other exemplars of this method. Michael Faraday, for example, did many things. In those days, people didn't have any discipline. There were no departments. They were all natural philosophers. This is why the PhD degree is sometimes called a doctor of philosophy. There is no philosophy in which most scientists study. Nevertheless, they get doctors of philosophy. Faraday experimented, and one of the experiments that he did was demonstrated the connection between electricity and magnetism. This is an experiment which is now shown in every school exhibition. Your children will be doing this, where you will take a magnet, and if you have a rotating magnet, it will generate a coil, electric current in a coil which is placed nearby. Similarly, if you have an electric current, it will generate a magnetic field and rotate the magnet. This connection between electricity and magnetism is what has given us electricity. This is the basis of producing electricity, the induction motors and so forth. But what is this connection? This connection requires a theory. That theory, of course, came when the Scottish physicist Clerk Maxwell unified electricity, magnetism, and light. It's one of the most beautiful unifications in science. When out of the unification of electricity and magnetism, out came light. And today we know that light is electromagnetic radiation. And the last figure whom I picture on the slide is Boltzmann. Boltzmann gave us an idea called entropy. Everybody would have heard of entropy because you would say, for example, our roads are in a high state of entropy because there is always chaos on the road. So chaos and entropy, how somehow disorder seem to be related. But what was Boltzmann studying? He was trying to understand what heat is. We all know what heat is. We know when a body is cold, we know when a body is hot by touching it. But in the 19th century, Boltzmann recognized that heat is nothing but the motion of atoms. And he came to the idea of the atom. And it is to Boltzmann that we owe, and that is what Bronowski says, that to whom more than anyone else we owe the fact that the atom, the world within the world, is as real to us now as our own world. He goes on to describe heat as not material any more than fire is, or any more than life is. Heat is a random motion of atoms. When energy is degraded, said Boltzmann, it is the atoms that assume a more disorderly state, and entropy is a measure of that disorder. The word entropy entered the English language. Today, entropy can be used by anybody. It's used by journalists, it's used by authors, everyone. Now, suppose we had a cataclysm. All of scientific knowledge is destroyed. Nothing is available now. And we were allowed to pass only one statement to the new generation of people. What would that statement be? Richard Feynman, in his famous lectures in physics at Caltech, said, I believe it is the atomic hypothesis or the atomic fact, or whatever you wish to call it, that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart, but repelling upon being squeezed into one another. Chemistry is the study of molecules, and molecules are composed of atoms. Biology is the study of large molecules and how they behave in living cells. Everything about you is chemical. You yourself now are a complex collection of organized chemicals made of atoms. And therefore, the atomic hypothesis remains one of the most significant advances in human knowledge. And of course, this is a picture that all of you know. The many, many images of the coronavirus which float around on the internet. It's a public health nightmare, and it's an artist's delight. You can color it in many different ways. You recognize it by its spherical exterior and all the spiky projections that you see on the surface. But how can it be defined? And I will show you on the next slide the definition of a virus. And I've taken this from a book written by the English immunologist Peter Medawar. The book is entitled A Philosophical Dictionary of Biology, and the title is Aristotle to Zeus. So if you look under A, you will find Aristotle. If you go to Z, you will find Zeus, and a definition of everything. If you go to V, you will find a virus, and this is a definition. Inasmuch as viruses are made known only by their causing disease or other pathological changes, the existence of benign viruses having no ill effects remains conjectural. No virus is known to do good. It has been well said that a virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein. This is a description of a virus. So today, everybody should know what a virus is because they are being afflicted by this pandemic. And many of them are actually getting sick with a virus. And a virus then, in Medawar's definition, is a piece of bad news wrapped up in a protein, which means we must now know what is the bad news and what is the protein. Open the newspaper. This is what you see. 24th of June, 22nd of June, in the Bangalore newspaper says the health minister. Almost certain that the health minister may or may not know what the Delta variant is. And concerns mount. So public health, policy, the way politicians react to these developments depends on their understanding of what is going on. But you need, in order to understand all of this, you need to understand chemistry. You need to understand biology. Why chemistry, you might ask? Definition of chemistry, and it's the best definition that I've ever seen, by Arthur Kornberg, a very famous biochemist who died several years ago. But when he was old, he wrote a reflective article in which he called chemistry the lingua franca of the medical and biological sciences. He also said that all kinds of people use different parts of the brain. The left brain controls analytical thought, logic, language, science, and mathematics. The right brain functions holistic thought, intuition, creativity, art, and music. Biology is very much more intuitive and at times somewhat creative. Chemistry is more like physics. And of course, mathematics is completely logical. So we all have our brains. We can use different parts of it. We can be creative if we want. We can be logical if we want. And we must have linguistic skills. But before I tell you the connections between chemistry and biology, what are the three pillars of modern biology? I showed you one. That was evolution. But there's another, which was erected again in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, by the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel. Mendel is the hereditary characteristics. This is something we all know about. A newborn baby must have some characteristics of the mother or the father, or both. Never does the newborn baby look exactly like the father or behave exactly like the mother. Always a mixture. So there is a transmission of characteristics from generation to generation. That's the field of genetics. Now, of course, every generation is not the same as the previous generation. You are not now identical to your parents. You're different. How does this variation happen? This variation happens through evolution. Evolution happens through natural mutations and selection. Selection is the most important word here, which Darwin introduced. Natural selection, the fitness of a mutation for survival in the environment. But how are these related? These have to be related by detailed chemistry. This is the chemistry of DNA. DNA is an abbreviation which is known even to politicians. They know that it is the genetic material. So chemistry is necessary to understand the connection between Darwinian evolution on the right and Mendelian genetics on the left. Now, when one talks about science, one always puts mathematics on a pedestal. And Galileo said that mathematics is the language with which God wrote the universe. Galileo, despite the troubles that he ran into with the Catholic Orthodoxy, still survived because he recanted some of the things he said. His predecessor, Giordano Bruno, was burnt at the stake. But if you take Galileo's statement, you might ask, what is chemistry? And I will simply define chemistry is the language with which nature wrote the book of life. What is the problem with these two subjects? Chemistry on the one hand and mathematics on the other. Biology is easy to convey. Everybody knows it because you're also a biological organism. You will actually appreciate biology very much more as you grow older because you will see a failure of your own biology. Now, in an era of disease, we understand biology. We feel that biology is important. Physics also you understand because you can understand Newton's laws of motion. Everybody does that to some extent or the other because you know what happens when objects are moving. You're also moving all the time. You're coming into contact with other objects and you see this. But chemistry and mathematics are abstract. Chemical structures are the language of chemistry. Symbols are the language of mathematics. It is important sometimes to know a little bit of science. Here, for example, some time ago, the former chief minister of Uttarakhand said that cows are the only animals which breathe out oxygen. Now, of course, the cartoonist immediately went to town on this, and I found a cartoon on the internet which had a patient linked up to a cow when he needed oxygen. In the last phase of the pandemic, of course, oxygen was on everybody's mind when we had a shortage. But no animal can actually exhale oxygen. All of us need oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation, and therefore we need oxygen to breathe in. Here, for example, from the pulpit of the Rajasthan High Court, a retiring judge said that, now of course, again, the newspapers went to town on this. This is not possible. This is a statement where emotion sort of overweighs science and biology. The public perception of chemistry is very poor. Chemicals are bad. And we find advertisements on TV which tell you that you can have house cleaning, bathroom cleaning liquids which don't have any chemicals in them. This is impossible. I would urge you to think about this a little bit. There is nothing that you can find in the world which is not chemical. Nothing. Everything is chemical. Even the air is chemical. Politicians, on the other hand, have an instinctive feeling for mathematics and chemistry. Here, for example, after the last Bihar elections, when Mr. Nitish Kumar and Mr. Lalu Yadav got together and hugged one another, Arun Jaitley said that the Bihar election was all about chemistry and not arithmetic. And the two newspapers said, Hindu, of course, was right. It said it was good arithmetic, but no chemistry, because the chemistry did not last very long. But of course, you have another picture in Bihar. Now you might ask, what is this? You might call this new chemistry, but old mathematics, because once again, that's what's been done. But I must leave the last word on chemistry to the Prime Minister. He said after the last elections that chemistry defeated arithmetic in the 2019 poll. So you can see that politicians have a word in the English language, just like entropy is. But now I turn to the coronavirus. Look at these images. Where did I get these images? I got these images last year, sometime possibly in March or April, when the lockdowns began. And it turns out that in many cities, Secunderabad, Chennai and all, there were imaginative policemen, there were imaginative auto rickshaw drivers who now had decorated either their helmets or their vehicles with the spiky image of the coronavirus. In France and Italy, which were very heavily affected last summer, Easter was celebrated in Italy with corona cakes and Easter eggs in France. So the coronavirus captures everybody's imagination. Look at the coronavirus picture in the middle. It's a beautifully spherical object. On its surface are these spiky projections, that is protein. And it is this image of the coronavirus which terrifies us now. But last year, and like all of you, that lockdown was quite an experience when it began in the third week of March. It was a remarkable experience because for the first time, we could not go out anywhere. We couldn't leave the house at all. Therefore, what do? You get onto the internet. And when you get onto the internet, you can ask some questions. And Professor Shastri said that the purpose of a series of interactions that you're having with outsiders is really to promote the idea of research. And then you might ask, what is research? Research means framing a question and trying to answer that question. Doesn't matter what the question is. Journalists do it all the time. Investigative journalism requires a lot of research. So I could title this part of my talk as how I spent time during the lockdown, or how I came to feature in a newsletter in Ure, Colorado. Ure is a town with a population of 1,000. It's up in the Colorado mountains. Here I was sitting in lockdown in my apartment, actually write something which appeared in a newsletter in Ouray, Colorado. Who on earth would be interested in what I write in Ouray, Colorado? But what did I write? I wrote about trying to find a photograph of the person who discovered the coronavirus. And I'm going to tell you about it. Eventually, I found that this person in her later life had actually retired and she died in Ouray, Colorado. She was a resident of Ouray, Colorado. So the town discovered through my article that they'd had a very distinguished resident long after she had died, that she was actually the discoverer of the coronavirus. And I'm going to show you how. And in the course of my research, all of it done by email, I came into contact with the librarian, the archivist at the Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. Her name was Samantha Meyer, and I wrote to her after we'd finished all of our research that it is a tribute to the power of the internet that the road from Ouray to Flagstaff passes through Bangalore. It also seems to me that in some strange way, the virus has led us to its discoverer by turning the world upside down. I had never heard of the coronavirus until the pandemic. And I asked a simple question: who was the first discoverer of the coronavirus? What is the coronavirus? It's an enveloped virus, which means it has a phospholipid membrane. Membranes are always things which are like detergents. And long, long ago, more than 100 years ago, the famous physician, William Osler, and if you look at the old scientists and the old physicians, they wrote all their papers in extraordinary literary style. Osler said, soap and water and common sense are the best disinfectants. This is why you're asked to wash your hands, because if you wash your hands with soap, that phospholipid membrane breaks and the virus then disintegrates. Don't worry too much about the technicalities on this. Here I show you a 1967 scientific paper. This paper, even this picture, which is in the middle of this paper, which is an electron micrograph of the coronavirus, appeared even in the newspapers in India at that time, because the newspapers in America and England carried it after an article had appeared, I think, in the National Geographic or the Scientific American. This was the characterization by electron microscopy of respiratory viruses grown in organ culture. It was done by scientists in England, David Tyrrell and June Almeida. I've only written one thing in red here on the slide. It says that probably the most interesting finding from these experiments, these are David Tyrrell's words, was that two human respiratory viruses, 229E and D814, are morphologically identical with avian infectious bronchitis. Morphologically identical means if you look at them, they look the same under the electron microscope. That spiky picture is what you see today. What is 229E? So I went and looked at the legend which was written below the figure, and then I found that the picture was of the strain of the virus called 229E. And then I looked at the acknowledgements in the paper, because authors, when they write, they acknowledge other people. And then it says here, Dr. D. Hamre for the 229E virus. So I realized then that the virus had been discovered by Dr. D. Hamre. Who was Dr. D. Hamre? I went back to the literature and found equality. Therefore, she must be a woman. And I was now looking for a woman scientist in the 1960s who had done this work. So what do you do today if you're doing research with the internet? You go to Google and click on Google Images after you've entered the name. And I got many pictures of Dorothy Hamre. They were all of young women. They were also of old women who had written books, children's books. They were young women who were much too young to have written a scientific paper in the 1960s. This was a remarkable paper because it even measured the size of the virus. Today, it turns out that the size of the virus that she measured is exactly the size of the virus that it is today. She also realized that this was what was called an RNA virus, which is what the biologists today are looking at. So I will skip this slide. And then I found this in 1968. A letter in Nature This wasn't a publication. It was a letter they wrote to the editor. The editor never put it down, but the editor simply summarized it, saying that a new group of viruses with the name of coronaviruses has been recognized, an informal group of virologists who have sent their conclusions to Nature and listed their names. There I found the name D. Hamre. So I then realized that D. Hamre was a very important person. She actually found the virus. But later on in 1975, when the coronaviruses got their formal name, her name is no longer there. So she must have disappeared. So I began to look for her on Google. And I also began to look for her in other databases which are available, like PubMed. I found lots of papers. I found papers which dated back to 1939 and 1940. Yet I found she's a very productive scientist. She had a publishing career spanning the period 1941 to 1972. Yet no photograph was found on Google Images. I asked the question, who was Dorothy Hamre? Then, in searching the internet even further, I found that the word Dorothy Hamre, the search term, led me to a library in Flagstaff, Arizona. So I wrote to the curator on the 29th of April 2020, saying, this is what I'm doing. By now, because of the way Americans keep their records, I was able to find out where she was born. I was able to find out where she did her degrees. I was able to find out where she died, because birth and death records are all digitized and available on the internet. So I wrote this letter, and then the curator was very nice. He put me in touch with a young lady who was working there, and very quickly we found that the Dorothy Hamre was actually coming in a collection of Alexander Brownlee. Who was Alexander Brownlee? He was her husband, and the papers had been deposited in his name. And it turned out that every photograph which was there in their collection was a magnificent photograph of the parks and the natural beauty of the American Southwest. Mountains, deserts, all of this. But there was no photograph of Dorothy Hamre. Then it turned out that one day I had persuaded the archivists there. They were so interested in this problem that they went in. Despite the lockdown in Arizona, I tapped into the library. And sure enough, they found pictures which they had never looked at all these years, and they found a picture of Dorothy Hamre. I show you one of the pictures which was found, which was right there. So today, if I were to make a slide on the discoverers of the coronavirus, this is the slide that I would make. I would put her on top. I would put Tyrrell and Almeida. But even in the virology textbooks, her name is not there. Why is she important? If today you were interested in this, one might do a study of Dorothy Hamre. Here is a lady getting a PhD in the years of the Great American Depression, getting a PhD before the Second World War, working, doing research, eventually ending her career as a research associate at the University of Chicago. And despite all the work that she did at Scripps, she never became a faculty member. So today, when we talk about women in science and gender equality and gender imbalance and all of this, you might go back and look and be inspired at the kind of work that Dorothy Hamre did and the fact that she died unsung. But Tyrrell himself was a remarkable man. What Tyrrell did was, he was investigating the viruses which caused the common cold. And the way he did this was, he took over barracks after the Second World War and converted those barracks into what was called a common cold research unit. Why was this done? Because the maximum loss of industrial productivity is because of workforce falling ill with a common cold in England. So they were trying to find a vaccine, just as we're trying to find a vaccine for the coronavirus. All that they did here was they took nasal secretions from people who had colds, and then they called volunteers there, gave them what they call a 10-day holiday in which they would now get infected. They would put secretion from one person's nose into a volunteer's nose and see whether they contracted the cold. And then they would get nasal secretions and try to isolate the virus. This is the kind of research which was done. And you can see how they were attracting people. 10 days free holiday, travel expenses paid. This is fascinating. Before he died, Tyrrell wrote this book called The Cold Wars and came to the conclusion that it is not possible to get a vaccine for the common cold because the rhinoviruses are mutating all the time. But it turns out that 30% of the common colds are caused by coronaviruses. And in 1996, Tyrrell summarized, he says, coronaviruses cause acute mild upper respiratory infection, brackets common cold. And this was the end of the interest in coronaviruses in the literature until the first SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003. But even then, the coronaviruses did not attract as much attention as they have done today. But I want to digress for a moment to show you a connection between how research has been done by telling you something that is topical. Look at the chemical structure on the top left. That chemical structure is a chemical which goes by the formidable name of trans-delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. I read the name to you just to tell you that chemistry sometimes is formidable because of its names. What is it? It is the active constituent of marijuana. It's the active constituent of hashish. It is the active constituent of bhang. In India, these have been used for thousands of years now, and they come from the plants. Now you might ask a question, if one was curious. How does a plant substance now act on the brain? Because people who take marijuana obviously feel happy. How does this happen? Why does the brain recognize this molecule? That's because the brain already has the mechanisms to recognize. But what is the brain recognizing? Why did the brain evolve that recognition mechanism? What the brain is recognizing is the molecule down below here. It is a molecule whose name you will immediately see as an Indian connection. It is Anandamide. It comes from the Sanskrit word Anand. Where does this molecule come from? Both the structure on the top left and the structure on the bottom left, triumphs of chemistry, were all done by a single Israeli scientist today who's called Mr. Marijuana, Raphael Mechoulam. He did this over a 30-year period. So he stuck to the problem. That is research. The techniques he used evolved with time. Eventually, he found using the techniques of biology on the left and the techniques of chemistry on the right, he found all of this. And he said that the natural substance which the brain recognizes, which is mimicked by the plant substance, I call it Anandamide, meaning from the Sanskrit word Ananda, meaning bliss. He was asked, you're a Jew. Why did you not find a Hebrew name? He then said, he joked, you may well be aware Jews are not very happy. We have a lot of words for being down and so on, but not so many words for extreme joy. So it would look like our ancestors were probably far happier than the ancestors of Jews. Is all of this important? I'd ask. Does this lead to more research? A knowledge of some of this is useful. Otherwise, we will not have this remarkable kind of outbursts which were there when these film stars were caught with a little bit of marijuana. We would not have all the narcotics agencies wasting their time on trying to find 100 grams of marijuana. The beginning of last year, this article appeared in the New Yorker. This shows that it is important to read things which are far from the things that you read every day. Does hurting make us human? It's a marvelous story. It's the story of a Scottish woman, pictured on the bottom left. She felt no pain. Not only did she feel no pain, but she had an expansive capacity for positive emotions. She never felt unhappy. What a wonderful state. Never feel unhappy, never feel any pain. What was her problem? She'd undergone serious orthopedic surgery and she did not even need one paracetamol. And therefore the doctors were interested and she immediately became the subject of study. And then this is what the geneticists and biochemists then found. In the brain, the molecule which I just showed you, Anandamide, this is degraded into two chemicals. And across the arrow, you find an abbreviation. That is the abbreviation for an enzyme, a molecule, a protein molecule which breaks Anandamide. So it's sort of recycling Anandamide. But how can that protein be made? It has to be made with a gene. So if there is a genetic defect in this gene, that abbreviated molecule is not made. Then this whole chemical reaction does not happen. Anandamide accumulates in the brain, and therefore the Scottish lady was perpetually happy. She was always happy. It's a wonderful state to be if you're always happy and you never feel any pain. But the underlying basis for this, what you might call a very, very interesting observation, lies in fairly complex. But I want you to think about something else, because when you say that you're working in the liberal arts, you're working in the humanities, you're working in the social sciences, I keep law and management aside. Law and management sometimes deal with the problems of human beings, but humanities and social sciences and other subjects sometimes deal even with much larger problems. You might ask, what's the origin of life on Earth? When did the Earth form? The Earth formed about 5.5 billion years ago. Grand formation of the Earth, a very hot spherical planet, burning hot in fact, slowly cooling over thousands of millions of years. The first life on Earth, which are bacteria, archaebacteria, appeared probably about 3 billion years ago. A billion is 1,000 million. So timescales are very large. These are what one would call cosmological timescales. These are also geological timescales. So it turns out that life evolved very, very slowly. Early Earth had no oxygen. What needed to happen 2.5 billion years ago was what is today called the grand oxygenation event. The photosynthetic bacteria came on Earth. They were able to use the energy from the sun to split water and produce oxygen. And this oxygen is what made our atmosphere. Human beings, and if you look, and this is humbling, you come really about 1 million years ago, well after the dinosaurs. If you look at the bottom part of the slide, the number 66 tells you the extinction of the dinosaurs. 66 million years ago. About 1 million would be where human beings begin to come, or precursors of human beings. This is all known to science today. But to do all this, you need a lot of chemistry. Where did this chemistry come from? Where did the water in the seas come from? Those are subjects which are still being researched. A lot of water which has come on Earth, it's cometary water. So today, if you analyze comets, and this is an analysis of the Hale-Bopp comet, which is available in the literature, many, many molecules are found in the comet. A lot of it is water, and it just comes down onto Earth, early Earth. So there are many questions which one might ask. Why is life the way it is? Will there be life on other planets? Bacteria evolved into complex life just once in 4 billion lives. All complex life forms on Earth share strange properties: sex, aging, death. You can ask, if life evolved on other planets, would it be different? Not a question that we can answer today, but we could probably say may not be, probably not. But since many of you are interested in things other than science, I want you to look at this. 200,000 BC. This is straight off the internet. The only place in 200,000 BC which had the precursors of human beings was the east of Africa. The little gray shade that you see. Everywhere else, there was nothing. Look at it in 32,000 BC. The gray shade has spread. This is 32,000, approximately 34,000 years ago. Now, about 2,000 years ago, you have your civilizations, which you all study. And we all studied also in school. Many parts of the earth still don't have too many people. You can see all the current geopolitical problems have evolved over the last 2,000 years. Even politics evolves, history evolves. But today you can learn a lot from analysis of DNA, from fossils. In fact, in this book written by a journalist, Tony Joseph, Early Indians, he says that analysis of DNA extracted from individuals who lived tens of thousands of years ago will teach us a lot. It will teach us where our ancestors came from. Were they always here? Today you have all these contentious discussions. The discussions are so contentious and so devoid of fact. Science deals really very often with available facts. I urge you to look at this book. Sapiens, written by an Israeli historian, Yuval Harari. It's a brief history of humankind. That's how he subtitles his book. This is what he says. The connection between history and biology. See, 32,000 years ago, all our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They were just like the animals. You hunted for your food, you ate it, the next day you hunted for your food again. That was it. There were no societies. Then he says the immense diversity of imagined realities that sapiens invented and the resultant diversity of behavior patterns are the main components of what we call cultures. Once cultures appeared, they never cease to change and develop. These unstoppable alterations are what we call history. Today, everybody is trying to rewrite history. But if you go back in time, all of history was written by biology. And then he says a very important sentence, the cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology. The cognitive revolution began when the brain began to evolve. There's very little genetic differences between the chimpanzee and a human being, but those are key genetic differences, most of them connected with the brain. Then he says, from the cognitive revolution onwards, historical narratives replaced biological theories as our primary means of explaining the development of Homo sapiens. He says here, to understand the rise of Christianity or the French Revolution, it is not enough to comprehend the interaction of genes, hormones, and organisms. It is necessary to take into account the interaction of ideas, images, and fantasies as well. You might ask, where did all our myths come from? What some people will call history, other people will call mythology. Where did these come from? When did these evolve? These evolved after the invention of agriculture. Agriculture is what made human beings stationary, transited them from hunter-gatherers to stationary societies. If you had a field, you had to protect it from animals and you had to protect it from other groups. So human beings also began to form groups and societies. But how do you keep groups of human beings together? You need images to keep them together. That is, of course, the evolution of all the myths and all the religions. We might ask this question, what is the evolution of mythology? What is the evolution of religion on this kind of grand timescale on which the earth has evolved? But to come back towards the end of my presentation, the burden of the coronavirus pandemic is very clear. What is there in red is the daily cases as a function of month going all the way to July 2021. You can see the United States, India, the world, we are all still in the midst of this. You could see on the other hand, China, where the virus originated, appears to have died down completely if the data there is correct. China now is grow in terms of the number of cases and the number of either the data is wrong or there is something else. What has all this led to? It has led to, in the literature, discussions on where did the coronavirus come from? Is it natural evolution or is it a laboratory creation? This debate is now heating up in the United States, it's heating up in many parts of the world. But when you look at the coronavirus and ask where did it come from, what am I reminded of? All I'm reminded of is a poem. And this is a poem which I read when I was in school. It's by the English poet, William Blake. He probably wrote this sometime in the 18th century, towards the end of the 18th century. And it was a poem about a tiger. It's called The Tiger. And what he said is, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? So evolution, for example, or creation, makes lambs and tigers. We might ask the question, where did the coronavirus come from? Is it a product of natural biological evolution? Or is it a product of some kind of laboratory work which has led to the release of the virus? Why do we suspect all of this? This is because you can go to the literature again. This is now fiction. John Le Carre, who probably wrote some of the most readable and realistic spy novels, his books. Survival is an infinite capacity for suspicion. And then he also says, and this would apply to me, because I've been looking at this literature, and for the last 1.5 years, I've been more or less stuck to my desk. A desk is a dangerous place from which to watch the world. Lastly, this is the last but one slide that I have. How do you end? I will end only by quoting Darwin on natural nice. This is because in Darwin's words, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And the forms of life that are being evolved on Earth are all kinds, and they have been evolved now over millions and millions of years. So there is connections here. When you look at nature, there will be connections between science, there will be connections between history, there will be connections between literature, and so forth. And I believe that asking questions is one way of trying to understand subjects that you try to teach. Finally, I would like to acknowledge, in conclusion, the two institutions which have provided me a home for almost my entire academic career. The Indian Institute of Science on the top left, where I spent 42 years, wonderful years, I would say. And then in my post-retirement days, I have been given shelter in the National Center for Biological Sciences, which if the virus had not intervened, I would have probably learnt very much more biology than I actually know at present.
Professor Balaram, you spoke about things that you are interested in, but I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the audience that you spoke about what you are interested in a way that you made everybody in your audience interested in what you were talking about. I'm getting messages here saying we have never had a more brilliant or lucid presentation of science in the way that Professor Balaram has done. Balaram sir, there are a few questions. I will pose two of them, and it would be wonderful to hear your...
I'm happy to answer if I can.
Yeah. Sir, there is this question.
If I can't, I'll tell you.
There is this question from my colleague from the field of journalism, Professor Devakar Shukla. He says, could you say a little more about this connection between brain, behavior, and society that you talked about? He says that interested him and would like to know a little more on that from you.
Journalism, I would say, for example, today, our brain reacts to information. And a thinking person, the average person probably does not spend a great deal of time worrying about what they hear. They accept it as true. And today, for example, thanks to Donald Trump, we have a new word, new phrase in the English language, which is called fake facts. So, it's a sort of contradiction in terms, but journalists today are of all kinds. And there are journalists peddling complete falsehoods. There are journalists peddling half-truths. And there are journalists trying to piece together a story with real facts. And they don't usually get too many facts to get a very interesting story. So our brains now react to what we really read or hear. Television is a form of journalism which is, I think television needs to be a lot more responsible than it is, because you have no time to react. You just, you're carried away by what is told to you and the emphasis with which it is said. So today we have television anchors who dictate how we think. And this is very, very unfortunate. I think there are two fields which, in my view, as an outsider to both fields, one is law, the other is journalism. Both of these need to now get their acts together to figure out what are the ethical standards of the profession. I think the ethical standards of the ethical standards of scientists are always a problem. We've always been worried about it. Ethical standards in the medical profession have always worried medical professionals. I'm not so sure that the bodies which control law and journalism are terribly worried about this. And they must be. See, if you have the Council of Architects, for example, they would certify architects at least. And therefore, you at least have buildings which are a little bit, the professional degrees in some way should have a certain level of professionalism. Journalism, I do not know. Maybe it doesn't qualify as a professional degree, but it is very much.
Balram sir, one of my professors of literature raises this question. How does science communicated in narrative format influence audience perception of trust? This is her question, that how does science which communicated in a narrative format influence the audience perception of trust?
I think if one is communicating science to a general audience, it's very important to put together a narrative which is understandable. It should still be factual, but it should be understandable. It needs to be stripped of all the jargon which is usually there. I also find that it's very, very difficult as a long-term scientist to sometimes realize that what you it seems obvious to you is not obvious to anybody who listens to you. But we need to do this. So I think scientists need, I think, a huge amount of introspection before they communicate things to the public.
Balram sir, one of my psychologist colleagues, Dr. Reena Rajput, asks, what about the belief systems and its connection with science? How do we relate belief systems and the connections with science?
One way, not things that go together, because even in science, or one of the things that I'm trained in is not to believe anything that appears even in scientific literature, but to actually check it out again. So if it doesn't get checked out, then everybody gets excited, and that piece of information is now discredited. So the word belief, we can't believe anything. We have to understand it ourselves. But I don't say, but science is not at conflict with religion. See, religion is something that is personal and private. Organized religion is a different matter. What an individual believes in is entirely up to them. And what an individual feels comfortable with, he should feel comfortable with. The science has no quarrel with that at all. But for example, you cannot have beliefs as the basis for superstition, which might damage somebody. Like you cannot have, for example, a belief that, let us say, a human sacrifice will cure a particular illness. No, that cannot be done. But this has been recognized for over a century or more, 2 centuries now.
Balram sir, one of our social science faculty, and also she's a law faculty, raises this question, and this is a very generic question, and I think your experience as a scientist and researcher would be useful here for them. What is the characteristic of a good research question, irrespective of the discipline you're talking about?
I'll tell you in my simplest, in my understanding of what I think is a good research question. Question is a question to which the individual wants an answer. An individual wants an answer because the individual is not able to find that answer when they search around the answer in the literature of the field. And today the literature is searchable on the internet. They can't find an answer but have a question. I think then they have to find the answer to that question themselves. They have to ask the question, how do we do it? This is why I illustrated it. I search for something as simple as a photograph. I want to find out what Dorothy Hamley looked like. I want to know something about her. I know something about Michael Faraday. I know something about C.V. Raman. I know something about J. Ramachandran. I know all those. But why do I not know something about this? Nobody seems to.
Balram sir, there have been, of course, besides the range of praise that is coming in about what you are saying, I I'm just wondering how to formulate this question. One of the participants asks, as a scientist and as somebody who has seen so much in the world, what would you say as an individual? How do you see the ultimate goal of humanity?
No, this is not a question that I can answer in a way that would please you. Okay. If you keep reading about evolution, and if you keep very, very disturbing conclusion, and that disturbing conclusion is that on the grand scale of humanity, uh, human beings are irrelevant to biology. Disrupting biology in a big way when they disrupt the environment. I work with a non-governmental organization called the Ashoka Trust for Ecology and Environment. And in this, I heard a discussion recently where one of the very thoughtful persons raised this question: what will happen if we go along like this for humanity or for the planet after 25 years? I didn't have an answer to this question, but if I think about this question, I wouldn't worry about the planet at all. The planet will take care of itself because the planet has a lifetime which is much longer. It's the lifetime, very long lifetime, until the sun loses energy completely. When the sun loses energy completely, Earth is over. No life can exist on Earth. But that's long way into the future because the Earth is a star which is burning up its fuel. So eventually everything comes to an end, but not on our time scale, not on any time scale that we can conceive. But 25 years is a short time scale. 25 years about humanity, they may do so much damage. Now, for example, if the virus was a biological creation, if it was a laboratory creation, why would it be a laboratory creation? Because people are doing research which they should not be doing. If you have a nuclear war tomorrow, you're doing something which you should not be doing. So you see that for biology, all politicians, all religions, everybody is irrelevant. After you have annihilated yourselves, fighting with one another, the microorganisms will survive. The hardier plants will survive. Evolution will begin all over again. So it humbles you in some ways that all the things that, I know Professor Shastri follows elections a lot and predicts. When you hear all sound and fury of electoral campaigns and all kinds of things which are being said, you only feel sorry for all the people who have to vote.
Balaram
Because
sir,
nobody is actually looking out.
Sorry, please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
You need to understand that it's a much wider world beyond the things that immediately concern us on a day-to-day basis. And that's what science teaches you. There's been a wake-up call. Somebody said the coronavirus, I think your Pro-Chancellor said that the coronavirus has given you an opportunity to rethink the idea of a university, maybe, because you have time for reflection. But the coronavirus has also told you one thing. You can't stop biology. Even if the virus was a laboratory creation, after that, natural evolution is what is giving you the variants. So every successive variant is a product of Darwinian evolution. So nature now is acting on its own. And you now see what the forces of nature are. No politician, no religion, no country, no technology has been able to stop the virus.
Balaram sir, there is this interesting question from a public policy expert who quotes Karl Popper and says that should not science be about falsification rather than justification?
See, Popper was a philosopher. Okay. Most scientists are practical people. It is the practicality of science which has given you every facility that you use without even thinking. without science and technology, you don't have your lifestyles. That is a given. And it is 200 years of science and technology on which you are living comfortably. Now, sometimes there are different kinds of scientists. If you have a theory, you need to falsify theory sometimes, because that's the only way you can find out whether the theory is right or wrong. Popper was thinking about such things. Can relativity, for example, be falsified? Okay, well, kind of thing. But in reality, much of science is not about falsification. Much of science is about interpreting and explaining natural phenomena in the best way that you can. There's a difference between the different branches of science. There's a vast difference between mathematics, which has a complete purity. The purest of mathematics is without application today. We have application 100 years later. But today, if you look at biology, a lot of biology needs tomorrow's application. So I think that philosophy department should debate about.
Right. One of my design professors is raising this question. She says, instead of seeing entropy as a form of destruction, it needs to be seen as a state of active play. Can collapse, chaos, disturbance be used for building the future?
Yes, I'm sorry if I conveyed the impression that entropy is destructive. No, in fact, thermodynamics tells us that we need to move towards a state of greater entropy. Life itself is organized. To be living, entropy is controlled. But in thermodynamics, free energies and entropies, enthalpies and entropies constitute free energies. So free energy is the quantity with which one deals with most often. But entropy in the common sense, when you say chaos, yes, many times in many areas, including in science, when a field is in disorder, it doesn't have a proper organizing principle for a phenomenon that has been observed or is not able to explain anything, and everybody is saying something or the other. That I would call a chaotic state. The most creative ideas come in that state. Yes, they do come out of chaos. See, this is why all the famous literature, poetry, literature, everything, some of the best of it has been written in the most difficult times, in times which are least comfortable, most chaotic, and so on. So chaos unleashes creativity. But I don't say that we should unleash chaos. No. We need to harness it.
Right. Sir, there was also this question, where do you see the main frontiers of science in the years ahead?
The one thing I think that I would not even call myself anymore a student of science. I would call myself an observer of science. I think there's one thing which an observer of science should not do. That is, we would not have predicted many things that have happened in the past. Some of them have happened in the time that I was doing research. They came as an absolute surprise. Sometimes people working on the fringes of science are the ones who actually find things. Those are not the hot areas. So even today, I would urge people to do what they want to do, what they think is interesting. Because even if it is a backwater area today, it might be a frontline area tomorrow if you make a discovery.
How would you relate, or how would you correlate science with what people would call ancient knowledge and the apparent contradiction between them? Do you really see that contradiction?
No, I don't see any contradiction at all, because in the first, let's begin. You choose your time scale. You can choose your time scale. I like time scales. Why I started with millions and billions of years. You choose your time scale. You choose 4,000 years, 5,000 years, whatever, whichever you like. And now ask the question, what was going on 5,000 years ago? What was going on 4,000 years ago? Now, if you come, for example, to, let's say, ancient Indian science, yes, let us say 1,000 years ago or a little bit more than that, wonderful things were being done at that time. There's no doubt, because you see a lot of things which were done in different civilizations at different times dealt with observables. They dealt with, for example, planetary observations which you could make with the naked eye. They dealt with medical problems in which you deal with on a basis because people get sick. So a lot of traditional medicine, observational astronomy, all of this grew at that time. And even many of the stories and myths and all grew at that time because of observations which were. Now, to take that as an unchanged fact and try to use it today would be a little bit difficult. Because if one is interested, for example, in Ayurveda, and modern science is interested in Ayurveda, even in India, we're interested in it. We're interested in finding out which are the best treatments, how does it work, where does it fit into the framework of what we have understood so far. I see as more knowledge accumulates, there will be an integration of traditional medicine and modern medicine in the area of medicine. But on the other hand, if you take astronomical observations, and now you have a derivative field which derives from it, let's say astrology, then you have this contradiction about whether you can, in fact, explain the future or predict the future based on astrology. So there are both areas where science is now getting much greater respect for traditional knowledge than it did in the past. Also, I would say that it's only now that we have some of the technologies which went to study also what you classify as ancient knowledge. A plant was extract was used in a particular clinical condition. Today we have the technology to find out what was there. Do things work as a mixture or do things work separately and so on? What's the connection to modern pharmacology?
Right. Anybody else who would like to raise a question to Professor Balaram, please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, Professor Balaram, it is really wonderful listening to you.
Absolutely. You are.
And because science is something which really excites me more as because of an engineering background. And it was really fantastic listening to you. About the entropy part, which you have mentioned, because we used to talk about delta S equal to delta Q upon 2, and the unutilized energy resources or the unutilized. Now, I see a lot of artificial intelligence and the machine learning is what is picking up these days in a lot of industries. Do you think there is this entropy or the unutilized energy can be more utilized when the machine learning replaces most of the process? Or I think the question is that whether with the AI, the science will have a more interventions in normal psychological patterns of human beings, because entropy is something which is very interesting and I keep reading a lot about that. So that's what I just want to ask.
Yeah, I'll just make one comment on your question. Entropy is most important as a word at the very basis of information theory as formulated by Claude Shannon. So entropy has come in, let's say, in thermodynamics in different fields of science. It has also come in information theory. Question about artificial intelligence. I don't know much about artificial intelligence, what I read, what I hear. But in my own field of interest, more recently, artificial intelligence has made a major advance. Now, if you ask me, and this is only without too much knowledge, I'm sometimes worried because a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning is based on a huge amount of data which is available and trying to use this data using neural network models to interpret new data which is now produced. This now does away with any human intervention. Now, the human brain does not work exactly the way the computers do. So a lot of what I would call intuitive and creative interpretations would be lost unless people who understood this were using artificial intelligence. If blindly now artificial intelligence might now work as a simplification that you don't have to think at all. The computer will do your thinking for you. That becomes a matter of science fiction after some time. You can see a general dumbing down of research when that happens.
Yeah.
Sir, I'm having one question.
Yes,
Due to scientific inventions and lots of discoveries, so many invention is taking place and the human society is changing at a very fast pace. Do you think that the robots will be going to replace human society in future, as what is being shown in most of the films and in the literature also we read it about a lot? Chat box. Do you think, sir, that human society will be going to be replaced by the robots in future?
Balaram sir, the question is, do you think robots will take over human
I don't think in
actions
the foreseeable
increasingly?
future. Look at human society. But look at human society, look at India, look at Africa, look at Latin America. I think all these advances are going to take, they haven't even come to America. So I don't think it's going to happen in the lifetime of anybody who's around right